I'd like to welcome everybody to our event today entitled Vaccinating the World in 2021. The importance of this goal could not be more clear at this particular moment, with the virus rampaging in India, Brazil, and many other countries around the globe. Overnight, UNICEF released a statement pointing out that among the consequences of the situation in India, one of the largest vaccine producers for COVID vaccination, is a severe reduction in vaccines available to the mechanism, the global mechanism that's been set up to help ensure that every country around the globe has access to these vaccines. And they predicted a shortfall of 140 million doses that were intended to be distributed to low and middle income countries through the end of May that cannot be accessed, and potentially 50 million doses missed next month as well. So the importance of this goal that we're going to be discussing today, this report that we'll be discussing today, I think is underlined by the current events. I'm a grateful former fellow of the Wilson Center, which is hosting this event, where I did research for my last book. And so I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. We have, of course, Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the founder and executive chairman of the Institute for Global Change, which is a nonprofit organization that has staff based in 14 African nations, the UK, the US, the UAE, Serbia, and Israel. The Global Health Security Consortium, which produced the report that we're going to be discussing today, is a joint initiative of that institute, as well as the Ellison Institute for Transformative Medicine and a team of scientists at the University of Oxford. Also with us today is Ambassador Mark Green, the president and director and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, which is a nonpartisan policy forum on global issues that produces independent research that helps inform policy through Congress, the administration, and the international policy community. And Ambassador Green brings to today's discussion his background, of course, as a former administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development, as a former president and chief executive officer of the Initiative for Global Development, a former U.S. ambassador to Tanzania, and a former member of the board of directors for the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So, Mr. Blair, let's start with you. How did this report come about, and what are your findings and recommendations?
Thank you, Sherry, and thank you, Mark, and everyone at the Wilson Center. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. So this report is based on a very simple concept, which is that, as we can see from what's happened in India, you have a variant of concern from South Africa and Brazil, California, the UK. The greatest risk we face is that the virus keeps mutating, and if it keeps circulating, the risk is that we get a mutation against which vaccines are either less effective or ineffective. And so the important thing is to try and control and get on top of the disease as fast as possible. So the concept at the heart of this paper is to say, okay, the US and the UK may be vaccinating a lot of people, but it's also in our enlightened self-interest that we vaccinate the strategically vulnerable populations in the world. And this paper is a detailed plan as to how we do that, how we produce more vaccine, get it distributed and absorbed by countries, and do that in a way which allows, even in those countries that aren't going to get fully vaccinated, for them to vaccinate at least their most vulnerable and the key workers and the most densely populated urban areas. And all of the aim of that is to stop it spreading. So we're putting this plan forward before the G7 summit, which comes up in the UK in a few weeks' time. And it requires organization. So this thing needs for us to be able to track exactly what is happening in the world, for us to boost production capacity, and we say how this could be done. And then for the vaccines that we produce to be distributed in the right strategic way. And we've got a proposal as to how that might be organized. But it's a matter of organization, it's a matter of leadership, it's a matter of the world coming together and recognizing that it has a common interest in making sure that as much of the world as possible is vaccinated this year.
Muting myself. Thank you very much. Very clear goals and very important ones, clearly. Ambassador Green, why should the US and other countries that have plenty of vaccine, it appears now, care about this goal and want, share in this goal? What is the argument for that?
Well, first, let me say I'm a great admirer of the Tony Blair Institute and the work that they've been doing for quite some time now in so many parts of the world. And so we're delighted to be able to add our voice to stressing the need for this report. So I think the US is at a crucial moment. We're starting to see some very positive signs, caseload coming down in much of the US, and those are all good things. But I think it's key to point out that there is no success, there is no safety unless everyone succeeds and everyone's safe. As Tony put it very well, this is enlightened self-interest. And I think that it's important right now because we're seeing too much talk in the media about any export of vaccines as being sort of a humanitarian cause. Now, I happen to believe in the humanitarian motivation for doing so, but this is in our self-interest because if we fail to elevate global vaccination, unless we get global vaccination to scale, we're really at risk of everything coming undone. There are hundreds and hundreds of COVID variants out there. Fortunately, a much smaller number are variants of concern. But unless we're able to reach scale in vaccination, there's a real risk that we will encounter a variant that will upset the apple cart and really undo a lot of the progress that we've made. Secondly, what I really like about this report is it's a roadmap to the future, a roadmap to success. I'm worried that right now, too much of the discussion on COVID is like a play-by-play in a football game, right? Everyone looks to see an individual bit of news and we feel better, or we feel worse, instead of sitting back and understanding how this fits into a much more important strategic framework that elevates the miracle of vaccines, mobilizes them, gets them to key populations. That's the only way that we have the safety and success that we all want to see.
Thank you. Let's delve in a little bit to that idea of key populations, because I think this is a way that this report is somewhat different from things that have been out before. So just to summarize, in anticipation of the question, the report promotes what it calls an equity-focused solution to allocating vaccines. But then it puts forward a plan that assumes that the entire population of OECD countries will be vaccinated, and then the strategic vaccination will occur in the rest of the world. And it also puts the G20 at the center of that, a new sort of allocation body, an advisory body that would help decide where vaccines would go, whether from the ones that are contracted by this mechanism called COVAX, or ones that the wealthier countries donate, that they may have extra doses, or decide at some point that it's the right thing to do for the reasons that you just said, to donate these doses. So I'm curious, because that could sound, from the perspective of the countries that you both have worked in, countries that maybe don't have enough supply right now, a little bit of sort of all the high income country populations get it, but we'll be strategic about who gets it in the rest of the world, and we, the high income countries, will help decide that. So I'm sort of wondering about how that sounds, and also because there already exists an independent vaccine allocation group already exists to help decide where vaccines be allocated through these current mechanisms that were set up over the last year. So I'd like if you could delve a little more into, first, this new idea you have about how to prioritize, and second of all, why you are proposing this new body on top of the bodies that are already there.
Sure, Sherry, those are two extremely good questions. By the way, just before answering them, if you hear a sort of rumbling in the background, there's not, from my side, there's nothing to be worried about. It's just that there's the thunder and lightning and rain are going on at the moment, and it's cold, so it's the British summer is in full swing right now. Okay, one of the things I do with my institute is what I do is give practical advice to leaders. So, I was the Prime Minister for 10 years. There is no way you will persuade the British people to stop vaccinating people in the UK and give the vaccines out elsewhere. What you can persuade them to do is, once we have got vaccinated, we keep our production lines running, because we will be vaccinated in the next 2 or 3 months. We keep our vaccine lines running. We distribute that vaccine, and there are mechanisms at the moment. For example, COVAX is a very, very important mechanism, but here's the problem that COVAX has got at the moment. A large part of the COVAX allocation was to come out of the Serum Institute in India. And because of the way the disease is rampaging through India, all of that vaccination, those doses of vaccination, have now been essentially taken for domestic consumption in India. So you've got then to look at different mechanisms for increasing production around the world, and we suggest what some of those might be. But let me give you a very specific example from the US right now. So in the US, you've got roughly 60 million doses of AstraZeneca. It's not yet been given FDA approval, but it's being used in different parts of the world, particularly Africa. This vaccine is literally sitting on the shelf at the moment. If we were able to get that vaccine out of the US and into Africa, we would, at a stroke, double the amount of vaccine presently in Africa. So there are some very important things that we could do very practically to help the situation. Here's another thing, because yes, it's true that, we're not suggesting that you can vaccinate the entirety of the developing world population in 2021, but we believe you can vaccinate the strategic parts of the population that are necessary. That's densely populated urban areas, key workers, the most vulnerable. But here's the thing, for a lot of these countries, for example, in Africa, they're not yet able to absorb and use the vaccine that's there. So even though the amount of vaccine in Africa at the moment is just over 30 million vaccines have been delivered through the COVAX mechanism for a population of 1.2 billion people, actually only around about half of those have so far been utilized and put into people's arms. So there's a whole series of other things that we need to get right. Vaccine hesitancy, by the way, being a big component of that. So I agree with you. In a sense, you can say, well, why isn't the world just doing this completely equitably? It's between developed and developing world. The reality is the developed world will vaccinate its population, but we can do this strategic vaccination of the developing world in 2021 and then ramp up as vaccines come on stream much more for 2022, the rest of the population. And that is, that's my best stab at what practically leaders could do in today's world. And the mechanism that we're suggesting is really one that's mandated by the G7, the G20, but sits with the WHO. So I think that is the body that, because it's the World Health Organization, will be seen as most credible for a group of experts to then say, well, how do you allocate those vaccines?
So Sherry, if I can just jump in, I think something that's very important for American audiences here. We've been thinking in terms of vaccine doses, and that's all we think about. We think about production. Again, it's almost like you're reading the Wall Street ticker, right? You're seeing things up and down. And what we haven't been doing enough of is thinking of that broader framework and understanding that it's not simply producing. We need to boost production and boost it now, not only in 2021, but going forward into the future. But it's also making sure that those doses actually get into the arms of key populations. And so it's offering a blueprint for building administrative capacity in many of these target countries to make sure that even when things get off the shelf in the US, that they don't sit on shelves in other capitals. It instead gets out to where it needs to go. And I think that's absolutely crucial. And it's also talking about over the long haul, making sure that there is a mechanism for coordinating production and distribution going into the future. I mean, let's be clear, not only do we have the issue of variants coming up, but it seems very likely that, for example, every Brit and every American who is being vaccinated is likely to require another vaccination, as well as the boosters that are coming on. So I would love to be able to tell everybody who's watching today that this will soon be over. Don't worry, no more shots. And that's simply not the case. What we can do is taking this excellent framework that the Tony Blair Institute has put forward and see how things fit in that framework. And again, that framework's so important because it provides long-term success. It really sets out I think a very practical future, one that we can all live with, one that allows the economy to grow, one that allows for borders to open up again and get the free flow of goods. All of those things, though, require not simply short-term thinking, but long-term thinking and making sure that we are looking into the future.
Yes, and the report really lays out like a three-step process for that goal of reducing shortfall in manufacturing, for putting in the incentives so that if manufacturers ramp up, that they will then know that there will be a chance to keep that capacity for future purposes so that they have sort of an incentive to do that. So very interesting recommendations for a short, a middle, and a long-term goal of improving that capacity to produce and to deliver these vaccines that the world needs, both for COVID and then potentially for the future. I wanted to ask you about one aspect of this that was the really intriguing one, and I'm wondering how you would propose to make it a reality. And this is this idea of establishing a global vaccine manufacturing control tower. So in essence, now there's this attempt, and the report does this, to pull together public information on the capacities of different factories, of different manufacturers, to try to understand, where are the raw materials coming from, where are the bioreactors to make the vaccines. But it's a very complicated global picture, and it sounds here that the idea would be the central hub that could use data to give enhanced visibility so that there could be more coordinated planning. And I guess my question is, how do you get the manufacturers to go along with something like that control tower?
Yeah, another great question. Well, you get the governments to put some pressure on them and say, look, we really need this information. And, it's actually quite difficult to get the information because, for very obvious reasons, companies think it's commercially sensitive, but you really need to know. And it's in everyone's interest that, for example, if Pfizer or AstraZeneca are going to produce a lot more vaccine than they originally anticipated this year, that we actually know those numbers so that we can think about, well, how is that vaccine best used? Because Mark made some very important points just there about booster shots and how you manage to get the right capacity in country to get these shots into people's arms. And these are things that are much easier to organize if you have the proper data. By the way, in an earlier report, we also set out plans for what I think is also absolutely essential, and that is for a proper global genomic surveillance system so that you are tracking the new variants as they arrive and getting them very quickly analyzed. I mean, we're still, we're very slow at doing this. And as I say to people, this is probably the biggest challenge of governance that the world has ever known. And having been in government, and Mark and I have both struggled with this, you get to learn what the toughest thing about government is. It's none of the things that people normally talk about. It's getting things done. It's actually moving from concept to reality. And the problem is with this particular crisis is that all the political pressures are internal in your own country. And of course, your own people. If you're a government, your first requirement is to look after your own people. And if you're in a democracy and you fail to do that, you're likely not to be the government. So that is completely natural. But here's the thing. It's so obvious when you start to analyze the problem that unless you also reserve some space for global coordination, whatever you do in your own country is insufficient. And so, for example, with this business of how you get to know which variants are arising in any part of the world quickly and are able then to deal with them quickly, this is of vital significance. And at the moment, most people think we're about, well, 10 to 20% of the way to doing that. And that, that's something, again, that is an urgent requirement and can only be done by countries working together.
Okay. So the report, I guess I would love to hear you, we have these big global gatherings in the near future. We have the UK and the US that are, developing strategies to address the current situation and put in plans for future pandemic preparedness. You just cited the surveillance, the important work on, setting up surveillance systems that will be much more robust. I guess what would be your main views on what the G7, the G20 countries, and the US and the UK in particular should be doing and contributing to this goal of vaccinating more of the world?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing is, the way these international things work, and I can tell you this from long experience, is you have summits that are either what I call communique summits. In other words, at the end of the summit, a communique is issued saying, we discussed the world, decided there were a lot of problems, we want to make the world a better place, and everyone goes home, right? So consequence, not much. Or they can be places where you actually get practical agreement. And if you want practical agreement, you're best to start building it block by block. So in my view, if the US and the UK come together and say, like, here are the 4 priorities for the G7, genomic surveillance, working out how we increase vaccine production, distribute them effectively, helping countries to absorb the vaccines that we give them, making sure that we're putting in place now plans for future global pandemic preparedness, as we're likely to get more of these things in the future. My view, if the US and the UK were to come together and sort themselves out, they could probably sort the G7 out on the back of that. And then if the G7 is able to build bridges to other countries, you've got a reasonable prospect of the G20 getting on board with some of those ideas. So, the practical politics of this is to start with some key players who've got strong relationships and build out from there. And that's why I think, if the US and the UK government that should see pretty much eye to eye on all of this stuff, if they're pushing practical plans, you've got a much better opportunity of getting them adopted.
So Sherry, I'm the development guy, right? So my training and my approach is to think around the corner. And it's really, I want to highlight a few of the things that Tony said. It's terrifically important that we think about building capacity in countries that are in need, not only right now, but have vulnerable populations going into the future. So we have to build that administrative capacity and in the future testing capacity, because they're really on the front lines for not only this pandemic, but sadly, the likelihood that we're going to face other epidemics and outbreaks, and hopefully those that we could sort of fence off. But it's key that we build that capacity out there. We need nimble testing capacity, nimble administrative capacity, to make sure that when we have these miracles of the vaccines, and they really are medical miracles and marvels, that they're not wasted because of bureaucratic bottlenecks or ill preparedness or lack of capacity in the field. And so as we look at the US and the UK, which are 2 of the largest players in international development, I think we have not only a special responsibility, but a special opportunity to foster that, so that that doesn't become what sets us all back. And again, the final point, I keep coming back to it, what I really like about this report is it's a long-term roadmap. And I'm worried that right now in the US, because we're seeing some positive numbers, we have this tendency to stop looking at it, right? To take our eye off the ball. We need to be thinking about what's down the line, because that's a real risk. We could see everything come undone. So, I mean, you could argue that we need to, that some have criticized vaccine nationalism. I don't criticize vaccine nationalism. It's in our self-interest to do these things. I do criticize vaccine populism. So where people are only looking at the immediate, if that becomes the only prism through which you're viewing this, then you say to yourselves, well, why should we worry about what's going on around the corner or overseas? But if you have enlightened self-interest, you realize we aren't safe, we aren't healthy, and we will not have succeeded unless the entire world is safe and successful. Vaccines, administrative capacity, and testing capacity.
Yeah, and can I just add to that, because I think Mark is making a few really important points there, and one I just want to pick out, which is in the medium and long term, how you build some capacity in the developing world. I mean, we're already working with many of the countries in Africa and also elsewhere, Middle East and elsewhere, to see how it's possible to get some of that capacity brought onshore to the African continent and elsewhere. Because I think one thing that's emerged out of this is that I don't think any large population country in the developing world is going to want to be in the position that they've been in during this pandemic, where they've ended up often subcontracting their vaccine acquisitions. They've then ended up in a situation where they don't have proper vaccine, and they're going to be wanting to build the capacity to do surveillance, to do some research and development, certainly to do production in their own countries. And by the way, you know, even in Africa, in, for example, South Africa, also in Senegal with the Institute Pasteur, you've got some real centers of expertise upon which people can build. So this isn't something that's pie in the sky. And I know that some of the main pharmaceutical companies are already looking at partnerships that they could have with those developing countries.
Yes, and I guess, and you know, maybe to say it more directly about just pivoting off of what you both said, and Ambassador Green about the world not being safe until, or us not being safe until the world is safe, and that is because of the possibility of the variants that could escape our current detection, treatment, and you know, prevention, vaccine, you know, current technologies. That's always a possibility. And then the economic one too, right? You know, and that is laid out in this report, just the fact that there will be very tough decisions if there's a part of the world that feels safe and is vaccinated, and you know, what happens when we have to keep borders closed because not everybody is in that situation. But it's interesting to think about what would all of these goals, whether it is the surveillance that you talked about, the ability of a country to pick up a new, you know, whether it's a new variant or a new pathogen, a new virus or bacteria, and then report that as they're supposed to do under international law. And then this concept of, you know, equitable sharing of public, what some argue are public goods. So there are some more radical, you know, proposals out there that every country should be sharing more, that, you know, there's calls from international organizations that immediately the wealthy countries, I think this was in UNICEF's call last night, that countries that are well on their way could give easily 20% of their vaccine right now to try to ramp up in the countries that can, you know, accept that that have the capacity to deliver vaccinations in other parts of the world. So this is all by way of asking you both, with your ample experience in government, you know, what will it take aside from goodwill or enlightened self-interest? Is there a need for, you know, a treaty? Several of the organizations that have come out with reports feel that some of what is already in place needs that sort of extra I guess, of an international treaty that countries would sign and then be bound to, and maybe have some consequences if they don't report a new outbreak, if they don't engage in maybe sharing of global goods. You know, do you both think that something like that is the solution looking forward? And if not, what else do you see as promoting these goals that you feel are important?
I know what you feel about this, Mark, but I mean, yeah, there may be a role for something like that further down the line. I mean, the only thing is, what you don't want to do is to go into a sort of political morass when you could be taking some practical actions. And the one thing that I do think is very clear, that when you get to 2022, you're going to have a lot more vaccine production on stream. You know, you're going to have, I think it's 3 billion doses of Moderna. You're going to have Novavax, you'll have CureVac, as well as obviously AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and then of course, you know, the Russian and the Chinese vaccines as well. So you're going to have a lot of vaccine next year. I mean, I think longer term, it's worth looking at some of these questions and obligations and so on. But I feel, maybe this is just my experience in government, but I'm just for the moment looking at really hard-minded practical solutions.
Yeah, so I think that the report that the Tony Blair Institute has put forward, I think strikes the right balance, right? So I think it is enormously practical in the sense that it is concrete steps for policymakers, both national and international policymakers, that I think present a roadmap to success. I think in the longer run, there are a number of things we should take on and be thinking about. First off, every nation already has reporting requirements. They're not following them, but they do have reporting requirements. And I do think in the long run, we should be looking at that and beefing those up. I think that's a very good thing. Secondly, I think we have to, in the long run, avoid the risk of fighting the last war. And that's always a challenge for us. So I had a professor back some months ago when I was still at USAID, show me a series of slides, photographs of labs that the US government had built overseas in response to a previous health threat. And they were put in particular locations because of that health threat, completely irrelevant right now. We should be thinking about nimble surveillance, nimble testing capacity, but I would argue more than anything else, health system strengthening, building the capacity in many of these nations. They're looking for it. I mean, it's not as if countries around the world are saying, we don't want to do this. They're saying, we're not sure how to do this. That's something that we should be investing in now, and we should continue to invest in the long run. But there's also something else, and it's something that Tony mentioned in passing, but we shouldn't just let drop, and that's vaccine hesitancy, which gets at a larger problem of understanding science in our public discourse. And Tony and I had a conversation a few weeks ago in which we pointed to the media crisis that occurred with the serious challenge of blood clots that may have been coming out of one of the particular vaccines. But most of the reporting didn't take a look at what the risk of blood clots from actually getting COVID-19 was. And so what was happening was that readers and policymakers were only seeing one side of the debate. Now, we may end up coming down the same way, but in order for us to have a meaningful discourse, we have to be able to put things in context. We have to be able to understand science, the challenges of science, the practicalities of science and medicine out in the field. So those are things in the long run we need to take on. We do need to think about vaccine hesitancy now, otherwise we won't be able to get vaccine jabs into arms. But again, I think this framework really lays out a plan that we can act on now as we're beginning to look in the medium term and the longer term on those other causes and issues.
I would ask Mr. Blair, do you want to address the vaccine hesitancy? It's even hard to say that, that issue, because it is brought up in this report. And then also, I think if you want to maybe lay out a little bit more about what this report says about the strategy, to maybe summarize that strategy to really get to this goal of vaccinating more of the world this year than had been planned or foreseen.
Yeah, sure. So on vaccine hesitancy, this is a big problem, and Mark is completely right to stress the importance of dealing with it now. We have countries in Africa which have refused the AstraZeneca vaccine or are not using it on the basis of the blood clot question. They don't have other vaccine. It is 100% clear that the safe thing to do is to use the vaccine. So this is a big problem. You've got, as a result of all the controversy, I think roughly over half the population of France, next door to us in the UK, that won't use AstraZeneca. It's madness. And you know, I have tried over these past couple of months, I have to say unsuccessfully, to persuade my government to do the following. So we are one of the very few countries, if not, I think we're unique in that at scale, we're using both messenger RNA vaccine and an adenovirus vaccine. So we're using Pfizer and a bit of Moderna, and we're using AstraZeneca. So we've vaccinated millions and millions with each of these two vaccines. And the results are extremely good for both of them. I personally think that if we took a leaf out of the Israeli book and published our data in the way I'm about to describe, it would lay a lot of this vaccine hesitancy to rest. But I would like to see numbers of people vaccinated. After vaccination, how many of them got COVID? After that, how many got hospitalized? After that, how many died? And I think that is a better way to express the data. And I'm having this debate with statisticians and others here, than doing it always by percentage, which is how we tend to do it. You say you're 80% less likely to get the disease. And you know, I entirely understand how you've got to present statistics very carefully, and you do need expertise to do that. But as I keep saying to people, the percentages, I think for normal people or lay people like myself, certainly, you know, if you tell me if I'm about to walk out that door that I'm 80% less likely to get hit by a thunderbolt than I was yesterday, I'm kind of thinking, well, that's good, but what's that 20% mean exactly? So, you know, it doesn't, whereas if you actually see the figures, here's with an unvaccinated population, no restrictions, here's what the disease does per million people. Vaccinated population per million, here's what the hospitalization and death rate is, and obviously they're very, very small. I think if you publish that in a really clear way with those macro figures, it would make a huge difference. And I don't quite understand why we don't. And in the US, you have got obviously masses of data as well, although I think the nature of your system makes it harder to collect all of that in one very, you know, visible place. But really the only way to deal with this and vaccine hesitancy is to launch a big campaign around it, because otherwise you're going to find that all of these vaccines, there will be small numbers of people for whom there are a problem, but the problems you will get getting COVID are infinitely greater. And just one other thing before I finish on this, that we'll publish a report in the next couple of weeks on long COVID. In other words, people who recover but still have a lot of problems, who don't die or even get hospitalized. I think, you know, we really need to educate, particularly our younger people, that just because you don't get really sick doesn't mean to say it doesn't matter that you get COVID. It's not a good idea to get it. If you can avoid it, do it. And then your second bit, sorry, I went on too long, was about the...
It's all important.
Yeah.
So the second bit was just about, if you want to just talk anything more about that strategy, the strategy part of the document.
Very, very simply is find out exactly where the vaccine production is happening, work out how you boost it to the fullest extent that you can using existing and some repurposed capacity, get it distributed according to a plan, and vaccinate the strategically vulnerable first.
And you know, speaking of the vaccinating the strategically vulnerable, and you talked about the importance of including children, and now we have these vaccinations, some of the vaccines being approved for younger populations in the US. But there's something that is very disturbing in a way to think about our young people who are so important, but who have less risk being vaccinated. And yet, as you mentioned, these frontline health workers who are fighting these massive outbreaks in some countries haven't had access to the vaccine. There's just something like that doesn't feel right about that. You know, just in general. And then in terms of the health system strengthening, of course, we know even in our country, I spent most of this pandemic in hospitals reporting, as a journalist, reporting on just the overwhelming of hospitals, whether they be in the US or I was in South Africa and in Somalia, other places. Somalia did better. They didn't have as much of a surge, but we are all vulnerable, of course. That's sort of been the lesson. Like we all have to learn about strengthening health systems. But in any case, just to end up with this question of vaccine equity, and are there more steps that the US, the UK governments, other countries that have better supply should be doing right now to try to right some of that really what's really in your face massive global inequity when it comes to this?
Do you want me or Mark? Do you want to?
You can both answer.
Tony,
Yeah.
why don't you start?
Yeah. Yes, no, I think there are things that we can do right now. And, I was talking about the AstraZeneca production line in the US, and the vaccines actually produce it. That's something that could happen right now. I think very soon, over these next couple of months, we will probably get to the stage where there are significant amounts of new vaccine production coming on stream. We could repurpose that. If you want to do the key workers in the developing world, I mean, that should be possible pretty much to do from the vaccine that's available now. And the other thing that we desperately need to do is to help those countries that don't have the resilience in their healthcare system to absorb the vaccine, to get that resilience. And it isn't that complicated. I mean, we're actually trying to put together now a sort of template for governments. But you've got governments in Africa. I mean, to give you a couple of examples of governments we work with: Rwanda, Ghana, Senegal. I mean, they are actually using the vaccine they've got. So, it's one of these situations. One of the things that this whole pandemic has highlighted, because this is what my institute works on, is the importance of institutional capability in government. The thing that makes the difference for countries today is the quality of their government.
That leadership point. Mark, Ambassador Green, want to take the last few moments to give us some takeaways?
Just want to emphasize on a couple of things that Tony has said. So strategic vaccination is so important because it means that we are understanding what the risks are and where they are. So getting, for example, vaccines into dense urban areas where we know the spread can happen oh so fast and variants can spring up at any moment. But secondly, we don't have to wait around on the supply of vaccines to build the absorptive capacity in the field. That we can start this very day, and we should work on that right now, because unless we get that, simply producing more vaccines and getting them into capitals will fall short of where we need to be on this framework. So final thought, I think the Tony Blair Institute framework is an important roadmap forward. We're delighted at the Wilson Center to be in support of it, but I think it really does provide a good framework for policymakers to take a look at this important challenge at this very key moment.
Well, I'd just like to thank both of you and our audience today for taking time. Everybody very busy with the response to delve into these issues and all of the work that went into this report. So thank you for joining us today, and wishing you all good health.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mark, and everyone at the Wilson Center. Thank you, Sherry.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Sherry.